Comes the recording noise. Welcome everyone to the second annual Network for Research on Morality conference. We're going to have our first session today. I'm really excited about it. I think it's going to be great to have Jack Bauer kick us off. And I'm delighted to have those of you who are here who can participate in this discussion. I think it's going to be a wonderful discussion, and it's going to be on a topic that's of really great interest to me right now. So it's perfect timing. So let me tell you a little bit about Jack Bauer. He's a psychology professor at the University of Dayton, and he's a former Raymond Roche Endowed Chair in the Social Sciences at University of Dayton. He wrote a book called The Transformative Self, Personal Growth, Narrative Identity, and the Good Life. That was published with OUP. And he is a co-editor of a book called Transcending Self-Interest, Psychological Explorations of the Quiet Ego. That's with the American Psychological Association books. So in these books and in his work throughout his career, he's focused on narrative accounts of how people understand their lives and their aims and so forth. And so it comes together really nicely for him to be able to talk about a good life story, which I think is a great way to think about the good life, because it's something that we have to put together and construct and understand and to some degree, and a narrative approach is a really great way to do that. So I'm very excited to have Jack with us. Just so I get a little bit more of the official kudos in here, he's a co-editor of the Journal of Happiness Studies and an associate editor of the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. So he's got some props. If you didn't know him before, and once you hear him, you'll also see what a wonderful thinker he is. So Jack, let me turn it over to you, and you can tell us what you want us to know about the good life.
Sounds great. Thank you very much, Blaine. Thanks for that really, really kind introduction. Thanks for inviting me here. Not here in my office, but in our little shared space in the moral electronic universe. And thank you everybody for coming. Today we're going to talk about, like Blaine said, Blaine, that actually you introduced the topic very well. I wish I was like taking notes on how you did that. That was great. Today we're going to talk about the good life and how it interfaces with the life story, and then how the concept of value can serve not only as a common link between these two different areas of research, but also as a way to help resolve problems in each area of study. I'm sorry? No. Value also serves as their tie to morality and ethics, and to so much else that matters in the development of personhood. I want to say that it's hard to explain this my model of the good life story in a linear fashion. Not only is it transdisciplinary, arising kind of simultaneously out of philosophy and psychology, so where do you start? But my understanding of the good life and the life story has each been shaped by the other. And so, I came to this model in a non-linear fashion, but more importantly, the good life story just doesn't work in a linear fashion. One of my main messages here is that the good life and the life story arise into existence together, mutually, and in tandem. And I'll try to unpack that as we go along. So let me see if I can, there we go. Good. So the good life and the life story come together in the good life story, which is a double entendre. A good life story is a story about a good life, as we think about it in fields like psychology and philosophy. A story about a good life might not be an especially dramatic or even that good of a story, but it's a story about a good life by any of many definitions, such as broadly beauty, truth, or on the other hand, a good life story is a life story that makes for a good story. Maybe it's dramatic, it's intriguing or entertaining, the kinds of things that people like to read or hear about. A life story that is a good story isn't necessarily about a good life in a virtuous or even a personally desirable sense. But the notion that a life story can be a good story means that people's life stories, like any text, can be analyzed for various qualities of narration. Now, this can get a little tricky on a personal level. I don't recommend treating, a loved one's life story as material for literary criticism. Like, hey, thanks for sharing that deeply personal story, but is a little incoherent and bereft of meaning. Don't do that kind of thing. But as researchers, we can do this systematically, scientifically, and not only qualitatively, but quantitatively, with measures of narratives that are reliable, as they are coded with high degrees of inter-rater reliability among researchers, so that the data correspond to something that's actually in the story itself and not just in the eye of a single beholder. And then we can do this for qualities of both a good story and qualities of a good life, which in the end are overlapping anyway. So the good life story, there we go. There are two distinct bodies of research. Like I was saying, good life deals, as you know, with qualities of a good life, qualities of a life that are and living and activity that are worthwhile, and in particular focusing on human flourishing specifically, and not that the overcoming of suffering isn't important also for the good life, but our focus here is going to be more on human flourishing. On the study of life stories, we're focused on narrative meaning making in the context of people's actual lives as they interpret them. And in particular, when we're talking about autobiographical life stories, we're talking about narrative identity. So my approach to narrative identity in the good life involves a handful of observations and propositions, which I'm right off the bat going to take some liberties with people who I know are interested in theory, and I'm probably asking you to indulge too much in this, but here are some basic overarching propositions for what it is for these topics. First is that we create meaningful understandings of our life in narrative form, although not exclusively so. And our attempt to do so is an attempt to create an understanding of our lives as good in myriad ways. To do that, we draw on cultural and other master narratives of a good life. And we do that for better or for worse, I might add. This point here, this one is key for this talk. Basic elements of narrative identity and narration, like narrative tone, theme, and structure, convey core elements of broad classes of goods in life, such as happiness, meaning, and wisdom. It follows then that measures of the elements of narrative and identity and the good life reflect each other, that not just that, but that they are narrative and not largely non-narrative, multi-method ways of measuring the same phenomena is what I'm trying to get across here. And that these measures then should correlate in very unique particular ways. These basic elements reflect different facets of value. And in a moment, I'll present a framework of value that organizes everything in this talk. Narrative identity and the good life are ultimately moral phenomena. I take the position that human flourishing is ultimately a moral concern, like Blaine argues in his recent book on flourishing. And many of us here, I take it, think also. The same goes for narrative identity. We construct a life story to make sense of our life in a world of others. Even epistemologically, the sociocultural underpinnings of language mean that a life story is structured linguistically in terms of actions and persons and intentions and values and motives that rest on notions of the good. The philosopher Charles Taylor first introduced me to that idea in grad school before I was even studying narratives, and had a big impact on me. In any case, narrative identity and the good life are both inherently developmental and sociocultural phenomena. The good life, for instance, doesn't just appear. No one is born eudemon. I would argue that no one's even born hedon. Aristotle even questioned whether anyone should be called eudemon while still alive. The good evolves and develops. Similarly, narrative identity develops throughout the life course, not always progressively, not always, certainly not always ideally, but always within the cultural and historical and biological affordances of one's social and physical ecology and master narratives. And so all this has implications for a host of moral phenomena that are often studied outside the world of narrative identity, but are entirely compatible with it. And generally speaking, regarding matters of ethics and epistemology. I tend toward theoretical compatibilism and methodological pluralism. And we won't be able to get into that too much, but hopefully I do this in not in a sophomorically relativistic way and toward integration when possible. I think human flourishing and narrative identity can be studied both humanistically and scientifically, for instance. Okay. So as it turns out, there's a really great book that Blaine mentioned a moment ago that came out last year to harness these perspectives to make sense of how we understand the good life for the self and others. And briefly, I'm actually not going to be talking much about the transformative self as a phenomenon itself in this talk, but it refers to a largely, but not exclusively, narrative identity that is organized around the value or theme of growth, and more specifically, a humane kind of growth. So the transformative self, and the topic of this book is not just an individualistic or an internalist model of the self. It's a model of selfhood and personhood that values the welfare and growth of not only the self, but others as well. So it's inherently moral. So for 20 years, I had been studying the fundamental problems of the good life and narrative identity, largely without realizing the deep connection between the two of them. And then it finally hit me that these are not just the same kinds of problems, but that they're the same exact problem. And it's the problem of modeling and measuring value in personhood, just with different methods and different theoretical starting points. This led to a framework of value that helps to deconstruct models of the good life and models of life stories, and then to rebuild them and toward an integration of the good life story. Okay, so I call this model the value orientation and actualization framework. And you'll see that it has a lot of qualities that are similar to many other models of value and meaning. It starts with the idea of value, and then breaks down its conceptual space in terms of not types of values, but facets of value. And the first facet deals with those types of values, and I call this value orientations. And now value orientation refers to not just the kinds of values that we consciously identify with and believe in, but also all kinds of unconscious motives, needs, purposes, aims that drive actions. Shalom Schwartz and many others have defined value in a similar way. In narrative psychology, Dan McAdams talks about value in this way, particularly in themes, as we'll see. Charles Taylor does, many others. It's important to note that value orientations may be conscious or unconscious, intentional or unintentional, explicit or implicit, extrinsically motivated, intrinsically motivated. Value orientation is a form of a desire, but it's a desire that we think that we have a reason to have, and that we think that others would have a reason to have. And I get that from the philosopher Tim Scanlon. I say that in this way that value is a nexus of pleasure and meaning, of desire and reason. But it's one thing to want something, it's another thing to have it, and that's what value actualization is all about. And it has value actualization is the successful enactment or manifestation of a value orientation in one's life or in a particular event. One part of that is value fulfillment. And that's something that you're familiar with. That's essentially, it's the satisfactory actualization of a value orientation. And many models of value fulfillment in philosophy and effectively in psychology follow this kind of an idea. There is a model of meaning that has three facets of meaning by Frank Martella and Mike Steger, where meaning has one facet that's about purpose, which corresponds to what I call value orientation. It has a part called significance, which I say corresponds to value fulfillment. And then they have something that's coherence, which is more structurally, it's about whether a value makes sense or a meaning makes sense. And that corresponds to one half of what I mean by value perspectivity. By value perspectivity, I mean the coherent and complex, relatively complex interpretation of a value orientation. Whereas value fulfillment is more subjectively assessed, value perspectivity is more objectively assessed. And I'll talk about what I mean by that as we go on. It might sound like, well, maybe isn't this something else? Thinking about a value complexly or coherently, how is that part of the value itself? And I want to say that it is very much part of the value itself, because any one value can be interpreted in a relatively simplistic or relatively complex way, or a relatively incoherent or relatively coherent way. So, for example, the value of fairness. Fairness, freedom. A relatively simple or simplistic, non-complex interpretation of freedom is more impulsive, more egocentric, more unreflective, more uniperspectival. Freedom means something like, well, I can just do whatever I want to do. Okay, a more complex interpretation of that same idea of freedom is more multi-perspectival. It's more reflective. It's more principled. It's more based on concerns of the self and other, where freedom means something like I can act freely, but I'm concerned about how my actions might affect others' freedoms. Okay, and so it's the same value, but it's kind of not, right? Because of its value perspectivity. So I think it's an integral part of value. All right, so now, how does that relate to the model of the good life? I know all of us we probably all have our own model of the good life. It's like everyone comes up with a model of the good life, so do I. But it's something that I between my studies of narrative and studies of the good life, like I said, I hit on this idea of how value is structured, and that kind of restructured and refined the non-overlapping qualities of broad classes of goods in life. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on this. For hedonic constructs, and this actually in the book goes beyond hedonia and eudaimonia to ataraxia and some other models from Eastern philosophy. But for here, we'll focus on hedonia and eudaimonia. The value orientation, one value orientation is pleasure. And this is kind of different. In other words, I think that pleasure is a value, right? It's not unheard of to say that, but it's measured in not as the satisfaction of a value, but it's measured as the motive for pleasure, as in Veronica Huda's hedonic and eudaimonic motives for activities scale. Where you see satisfaction measured, like in the life satisfaction scale or any number of measures of hedonic well-being, that's a value fulfillment. That's the value of pleasure, regardless of the particular context of meaning. So like satisfaction in life. I suppose life is a context compared to non-life, but it's about as broad as you get. It doesn't have a specific meaningful context when you are assessing like in the self-report measures of satisfaction. Value perspectivity is something that hedonic philosophers tend not to be too concerned with, and I don't know of any measures of that. For eudaimonic constructs, we've got the value orientation of meaning, which I'm using as a broad umbrella term for the endless eudaimonic lists of goods. Okay, and here we're talking about not the presence of meaning in life, like in Mike Steger's meaning in life questionnaire, but the motives for meaning, like we'll find in the eudaimonic motives of Veronica's measure, or in the Schwartz values, the Haidt foundations, or self-determination theory motives, any number of things, some of which are moral, some of which are not. All those are getting at value orientations. But when you get into eudaimonic value fulfillment, there we're talking about meaningfulness. And so this is how I differentiate satisfaction and meaningfulness. Others have done this as well. And it's measured in things like with scales like Riff's psychological well-being, which has essentially 6 different contexts of value or meaning in life. Corey Key's social well-being, self-determination theory, need fulfillment, but not the motives. Okay. And for value perspectivity, this is where wisdom comes into play. And I'll argue that, or I argue in the book that the defining characteristic, or at least the distinguishing characteristic of wisdom that separates it from meaningfulness, is this idea of value perspectivity. Many measures of wisdom, especially self-report measures, have a lot of not so much affectivity outside of context, but have a lot of meaningfulness, and there's a lot of value fulfillment in those items. And I'm interested, well, what about those items is wise versus just meaningfulness? It's been something that plagues me for some reason. It's a question that drives me. And I've come to the conclusion that it's value perspectivity, as wisdom as phronesis, though isn't just value perspectivity. Wisdom is not just thinking complexly and coherently. That's just high levels of, that's something approximating high levels of reasoning or knowledge generating, differentiation and integration, that idea. Wisdom is more than that. Wisdom is, as from what I can tell, to summarize measures that are especially open-ended measures that get at, these open-ended measures get at how complexly and integratively or coherently we think about matters of humane concerns. And so Igor Grossman's wise reasoning task, or Jane Levenger's ego development measure, Judith Gluck and Susan Bluck's Moore measure, Labo VVF's dynamic integration measure, all these get at this combination of complex and coherent reasoning about humane concerns. Okay, so that's that. Finally, a narrative. This has been a long time coming. I appreciate you hanging in there as I build up this groundwork. This is a narrative from a woman who was age 48 at the time. She said, I was 12 and my dad was an usher in the church and only men could be ushers. And I said, but why can only men be ushers? Basically, you escort people to their seats and distribute baskets. I don't understand why only men can do that. And my dad was like, well, it's just what men do. And I was like, but that doesn't mean a woman can't do it. And so I petitioned the church and I went to a priest and I said, I see no reason why I can't be an usher. And my mom went with me and I set off this huge firestorm. And I said, I'm not going to take no for an answer. These are the 5 things they do. And I could do these just as well. And I'd like to do that as part of the church. Well, it took a while. But I did become an usher at age 14. And that's the story. The meaning behind it is that I've always fought for women's rights. I think it caused some consternation for my dad, but yes, I think he was proud. Okay, that's an excerpt from a 2-hour-long life story interview where this person viewed this memory as what Jefferson Singer calls a self-defining memory, an event whose themes resonate with the deepest and most important themes in one's life story. And I'll say that this woman today conducts scientific research on social injustice and child welfare. Okay, so the story conveys certain virtues and qualities of a good life that we'll all find different aspects to it of that in this narrative. But what about the narrative elements of tones and themes convey these goods? Turning back to our framework here, value orientation, the way a narrative conveys value orientation, values, motives, these kinds of things, is through narrative theme. Themes like agency or communion or growth. And there's not the attainment of growth, but the valuing, the desire for growth. Moral values and motives. All these can be, we're talking about thousands and thousands of different kinds of themes here. Okay. And here we see, I've highlighted some of the themes of moral agency and oppression here. So, why only men? Well, it's just what men do. But that doesn't mean a woman can't do it. And so I petitioned the church. So there's, we see a lot of themes of agency and moral beliefs and rights, agency as taking action, as having an impact, agency, but also communion, such as, I set off this huge firestorm. Now, it doesn't sound very communal. Most of us think of communion as things getting along and friendship and things, and that is part of it. But I think that combines tone and theme. That's a positive communal theme. A negative communal theme is when I set off this huge firestorm. That's going to be an important point as we move forward. Agency is resolve. I'm not going to take no for an answer. Agency is reason. There's 5 things I do. So she's setting this out. A communion is belongingness. She wants to do it to be part of this group, part of the church. Communion as respect toward the end. He was proud. Communion is interpersonal struggle. Consternation with my dad. Sorry, I sit right next to a bell tower here. Sorry if you're hearing that. So in this model of the life story, value orientations and motivational themes tell us only what people want, but they don't tell us how things turned out. To do that, we need a tone. We need some assessment of affectivity. The tone of a narrative is really the most simple form of evaluation. It's just positivity or negativity, regardless of context. Okay, so the type of meaning doesn't matter for tone, and we have all kinds of measures of narrative tone that are well established for a couple of decades now, where you can measure just the global positivity and the global negativity of a particular narrative event. You could measure the positive or negative outcome of that event. How did things turn out? Changes in positivity or negativity, such as the most popular one that's measured is the effective sequence of redemption, where things go from start off bad and end up good, as in a story that goes from rags to riches, or sickness to health, or ignorance to enlightenment. These kinds of things, all those different types of redemption, those different types are different themes. They're all value orientation. One is about money, one is about knowledge, one is about health. Okay, but what they share is a similar tone, and the change from negative to positive. And so here in brief summary here is that tone essentially conveys whether and the degree to which a narrative is good or bad, but a theme conveys why it is. And here we see, highlighted some of the starting off where things were difficult or bad, and then it ends up things work out and are good. Okay, then value perspectivity is something that narratives convey through their structure. Structure, 2 of the most common ways to measure narratives scientifically in terms of structure are coherence and complexity. Okay, so here are some phrases and words that suggest the complexity of this. And complexity can, this is really only a moderately complex narrative. Questioning why something is, rather than just accepting it. Then somebody else was involved, so there's social positioning there, and then questioning the reason again, and then setting off a conflict between people or among people. And I'm not going to take no for an answer, just the idea of rejecting an idea of differentiating points of view. Various other ways of this narrative suggests a moderately complex structure, but it's highly coherent, with a very clear sequence of actions following a story pattern that we know that things start off with a problem and then there's a resolution. It's very coherent. Here's another very different kind of narrative with themes that have moral relevance, such as love and humane insight. This woman is aged, she's 65, and she said, I was about 55, 56 years old. My granddaughter and I were lying on my bed. I suddenly felt this incredible love for her, and almost simultaneously, I felt a surge of deep pain and sadness as I became conscious, I feel, for the first time, that the price of loving so completely, so unconditionally, is that the other side is that I would feel excruciating pain if she were to die or be separated from me forever. This event is significant because I felt so alive, so capable of being loving without consciousness about acceptance, non-acceptance, and other self-centered thoughts. The awareness of the other side of connection is lost, and I know this, have felt this sense. And the knowing has greatly enhanced my life, much more freely able to love and to understand why I've been so fearful of this kind of loving in the past. Okay, this is a very complex narrative. Most narratives in our studies don't get this complex, or this don't unpack one's psychological processes so much. Even the narratives of psychologists don't unpack them this much. There are so many words and phrases that convey themes that it's scarcely worth it to point them out individually. It's almost the whole thing, but there's interpersonal love, there's communion, the negative part of communion, which is like a negatively valenced communal theme of loss. There's agency as realization and insight. Agency is vitality, if I felt so alive. Agency is efficacy or competence, feeling capable, all kinds of things like this. And the structural analysis of this one, I think, is really interesting too. This one scores pretty high on the scale of complexity, but it only has like a moderate level of coherence. It's really not even about actions. There's one initiating action, but the rest of it is her inner experience of things, and so it doesn't follow the what we consider a typically coherent narrative. It still scores relatively high in coherence because you can figure out what's going on and it still makes sense. But it's a little rambling compared to a super coherent narrative. And you can see how complexity and coherence can sometimes fight against each other. But in any case, my granddaughter, almost simultaneously, I felt, became conscious for first time. There's a lot of elaboration. There's contrasting points of view. There's flashbacks. There's all kinds of narrative devices to differentiate points of view in this, in the structure of this narrative. Okay, so there's that. Now, I'm going to try to pull this all together for a good life story. So you see in a single chart here what hedonic narrative and eudaimonic narrative constructs look like. Value orientation is conveyed. We have all kinds of measures, we self-report measures of actually not a whole lot actually of motives for pleasure, but it's conveyed in the narrative theme of pleasure. Okay, the meaning motive is conveyed in the narrative theme of any kinds of meanings, agency, communion, these different kinds that we've been talking about. Then there's satisfaction, is a value fulfillment, right? And that's conveyed by positive narrative tone when it's not associated with a theme. Now, most narratives, almost all narratives, have some kind of theme in them. The kinds that don't, maybe I should have given an example, but it's just a narrative that doesn't explain why something was important. They just say this, it's filled with a bunch of actions, and then the person says it's good or bad. But even when there are narratives with themes like the ones that we just were looking at, they can be measured for only tone. And many, in fact, tone is by far the most commonly measured narrative construct. And when tone is measured without theme, what it's conveying is the level of satisfaction in that narrative. And so what do you know? It correlates with measures of satisfaction. So high levels of positive tones in people's life stories correlate with measures of self-report measures of satisfaction. As for meaningfulness, I guess you get meaninglessness in there too. There are themes of that. But meaningfulness is a hybrid of these deconstructed tone and theme measures. So when you have a positive narrative tone that's been associated with or coupled with, or statistically, you can run an interaction with these two things, with humane or humanistic kinds of themes, we see that these types of tone theme hybrids convey the fulfillment of experientially or personally meaningful events. I should say that I'm one of very, very few narrative researchers who deconstruct their narrative themes in this way. Almost every measure that you're going to find on narrative themes confounds, in my view, tone and theme. What they're coding for usually is the fulfillment of a particular theme. And that's fine for whatever your research purpose is. That's fine. You don't have to be a purist about this thing. But I'm interested in how do the different component parts of narration relate to the component parts of broad classes of goods in life. And so when deconstructed, I see most measures of themes as actually a statistical interaction of tone and theme. Value perspectivity, again, there's not really a narrative component to that. But for wisdom, we see wisdom expressed in narratives that are hybrids of complex and coherent structures with, again, humane themes. And it's not just that, we know research on this, some great research on this has been done by Nick Westrate and Judith Gluck and several others. But what they're doing is, and I do some of this research, showing how it's not just that these measures correlate with other measures, particularly performance or open-ended measures of wisdom. It's that this is how we convey wisdom. This is what wisdom sounds like in a narrative. When we see a narrative with complex and coherent structure and a humane theme, we think that's wisdom. That's what one of the things I'm arguing. And so, yeah, let's get past this. We won't talk about that. Some findings. So there was a study that my colleague and friend Peggy Desautel here in our philosophy department and I held that was funded by the Self-Motivation and Virtues Project that was coordinated by Nancy Snow and Darsha Narvaez. And I want to summarize the findings. There are just tons of tables, and so I'm doing a talk without presenting any tables, but here's the bottom line. All kinds of narratives that we measured, narrative like tones and themes and structures, correlated with various measures of flourishing, such as happiness, meaningfulness, and wisdom. But when we regressed, say, happiness or hedonic well-being, so subjective well-being, Diener's formula for that. When we regress subjective well-being on all the narrative variables that correlate with subjective well-being, we find that only positive outcome tone continues to be significant, is what we found. So there's a strong relation between that, and that's what we predicted. That's the idea, is that because that's how we convey hedonic well-being in our narratives, is the tone. Themes of experiential growth, which just in a nutshell are not themes that, oh, I've grown, but themes that convey the types of things that theoretically lead to personal growth, of kinds of personal growth. And these are essentially humanistic or humane themes versus materialistic or egoistic themes. Okay, and we find that these themes are especially predictive of eudaimonic well-being, even controlling for positive outcome affect. That dropped out of the equation. Themes of experiential growth also predicted wisdom, measured as a facet of Brzezinski's measure of identity development called identity exploration, which we considered a form of wisdom. Experiential growth also predicted various virtues, which are combinations. Sometimes they're motives, sometimes they're value fulfillments, but altruism, gratitude, forgiveness, compassion, a whole host of others. Structural complexity also correlated with wisdom. Okay, so those are the deconstructed narratives, and they performed much as we would expect. In fact, we didn't think it was going to be this clear, so that was nice. But when we look at the hybrids of these things, so tone by theme, when we're looking at how a narrative conveys meaningfulness, we found that predicted meaningfulness. Okay, so measures of eudaimonic well-being, like Riff's psychological well-being, that's a measure of meaningfulness. It's a measure of satisfaction, but in specific context of meaning. We found that tone and theme, positive outcome affect, its interaction with growth themes predicted psychological well-being when controlling for its component parts of positive affect, positive outcome affect, and eudaimonic growth individually. So the way a narrative conveys meaningfulness, which again is how most narrative researchers study themes anyway, is especially powerful, at least in this one study we did with life stories. Theme by structure. So we have something called reflective growth, which is also involves a motive for humane concerns, but for learning about people, learning about the self and others, wanting to know more about how people work and these kinds of things, wanting to gain new perspectives on life. This reflective growth theme, when coupled with a complex structure, narrative structure, was especially predictive of various measures of wisdom. Ardell's measure, the three-dimensional wisdom scale, perspective taking, several other measures. So we see that we've got some empirical evidence. It's just a start, but to show that the deconstructed measures work as we would think. All right, so I had said early on that I've learned some lessons about how the good life works from narrative, and I've learned about how narrative works from my studies of the good life. And I want to kind of summarize some of these for you, if this works. So we'll look at hedonia versus eudaimonia, and also narrative tone versus theme. So hedonia is the philosophical claim that pleasure is the ultimate good in life. Okay, I didn't learn that from narratives. That's just kind of standard boilerplate stuff. And to the degree that you can have that. And then eudaimonia is meaning, philosophically meaning is the ultimate good in life. And by that, again, I mean this umbrella term for however you're going to define your eudaimonic good. All right, on the narrative side, we have tone conveying affect, whether events are good or bad, and it conveys satisfaction without regard to context, the context of meaning or value. One of the things that hit me, it actually hit me in the shower, but I didn't want to make an icon for that earlier, but in any case, is satisfaction with hedonia. That's what that is, I think, is satisfaction without regard for context of meaning and value. Now, Owen Flanagan once said that, really no hedonic philosopher actually thinks that only pleasure matters. Some other good will apply in some way. So like Wayne Sumner's authentic happiness, like authenticity, something like that will be, but it's always toward a more internalist model of the self. And it has I'm getting this from Dan Hebron, of an internalist model of the self that is, the pleasure is defined not in terms of context, but ultimately what matters is just this pleasure and satisfaction. Well, to get beyond the pleasure and satisfaction in narratives, we have themes, right? And they convey values, motives, they convey why events are good or bad. They are the context and meaning, and the theme is the context and meaning. What a story is about is a theme, more or less. And it hit me that that's what eudaimonia is about. And so that eudaimonia prizes the context. And this is a little bit different than something like when Ken Sheldon says that, the eudaimonic variables are the independent variables and the hedonic goods, that's the dependent variable. Yeah, you can frame it like that, but that's not quite this. This is more, it's that pleasure and meaning function on different levels of context. One without context, abstracted from context, and one is deeply immersed in context. So with narrative tone, it had been a while since I had been thinking that these two things are irreducible, like affect and value are irreducible, and they function on different levels of context, and each is necessary but not sufficient for narrative meaning making. And I'm like, I think that's what's going on with the good life too, that pleasure and meaning are irreducible and that they just function on different levels of context. Like in the world of evaluation, it's all about evaluation, right? Pleasure is just the view from 30,000 feet. And what can you see? Just the simplest form of evaluations, positive and negative affect. And then meaning, eudaimonia is concerned with the ground and what's going on, in the specific context. And so I think that each is necessary, but not sufficient as a candidate good in life. That, in developing models of good lives, I think, candidate goods are maybe the way to go, at least at a meta level, rather than saying that, yeah, you have to have this particular quality, saying, no, maybe you don't. So you don't have to have pleasure in life to have a good life. You could be living a morally virtuous life. You could be living a wise life, and you could have very little pleasure, and still would, of course, be a good life. And the reverse would be the case too, I would argue. It's just not good defined so much in the moral sense. And, but, you ask someone who's wise, but lacking pleasure, whether something's missing in life, would life be better? Yeah, it would be that much better. And that's an oversimplified way of getting at this general idea of a candidate good. Okay, so there's that. Then for problems of well-being versus wisdom, satisfaction is how we measure in hedonic value fulfillment. Positive tone conveys that. Meaningfulness is eudaimonic value fulfillment. And positive tone by theme conveys that eudaimonic value fulfillment or meaningfulness. And for wisdom, we have structural complexity and coherence, kind of helping to differentiate wisdom as being rooted in this idea of value complexity, of value perspectivity. I guess that's, that's all I'll say on that. So, okay, so how are we doing on time here? I think we're pretty much running out.
Yeah, I think we're pretty close to the end of the talk time. So
yeah,
that would be great if you could kind of bring it to a conclusion.
Wrap up. Sure. I wanted to talk, boy, in practice, I got through much more. So in any case, so let me just do this. Some of the things that, so far I talked about essentially the first section of this book, minus the cultural master narratives. And, but there's, how there are cultural master narratives, there's the personality and the social ecology and the master narratives of transformative self and of personhood. And these cultural master narratives are something I do want to say one thing about. How these things develop is important. And then, what are the humane concerns and growth concerns? There are problems to them. There's a dark side to growth. And then there's the heights, things like authenticity and self-actualizing, these kinds of things. But I do want to say one thing on cultural master narratives, and I'll leave you with that because I think some of you might be interested in this. And culture master narratives convey a culture's values, their ideals, their definitions of a good life. We see them in prototypes of stories. We see them in genres in literature and film. And we create our own life stories as we draw, and by drawing on the themes and other narrative elements of our cultural master narratives. Again, these master narratives are all around us. They're in the political discourse and religious text and discourse and all kinds of places in society. But they also, as Moin Syed and Kate McLean emphasize, cultural master narratives have a kind of rigidity of values or rigidity of themes to them. They perpetuate the hegemonic societal structures against marginalized individuals, perpetuating those values that those with power and resources can't access. And this can be a problem even for the cultural master narrative of personal growth, which is what I study and plays a big role in my book. But it's the Bildungsroman genre of coming of age, of being dissatisfied with the bourgeois materialistic values of your youth, and striking out and seeking out wise teachers and adventures, and cultivating deeper human experiences and knowledge, striving toward enlightenment, whatever it's going to be. Even that narrative, which started off back in Goethe's day as a countercultural master narrative against the materialistic master narrative, has become a cultural master narrative. So it's one that presents problems, not only because historically the figures have been largely white males, but it requires financial resources too. It's a luxury to be able to drop out of your life story, like the typical protagonist of the Bildungsroman, and start a new kind of story in a different environment. So I think I'm going to leave you with that idea that all these properties of the good life and narrative identity that function at the level of the individual also function on the level of society through cultural master narratives. And that these two things are not separate, that they interact and they affect each other in a dynamic way. So with that, I will skip ahead here. Oh no, I won't skip ahead. There, now I can skip ahead to this. Thank you very much. Okay.
Or as they sometimes do,
Right.
to not make noise.
Right.
Thank you very much for that talk, Jack. It's a great example of the way in which narrative research is almost magical, in my view, that you're able to reach into these interviews and draw out themes and tones and recognize them across individuals, and then show that they actually relate to important things in the world as well. And it's a wonderful kind of research. So I always really enjoy it. So let me give one pitch for the other three talks we have coming up. I should have done this in the beginning, but I'll do it now. So we're going to have Maria Silvia Valcareza speak next week on practical wisdom. She has some very interesting things to say. And then we'll have a talk by, I should have brought my notes. We have a talks by Matt Stichter and Tobias Kretnauer as well. So we're going to get a variety of perspectives on moral research, and that's going to be wonderful. So I hope you can be there. And if not, all of these will be recorded, so they'll be available to you asynchronously as well, if you can't make it at the time. That's for what's coming up. So through May, we're going to be enriched multiple times. So I really appreciate the people who have agreed to do that, and I really thank you for that too, Jack. So going forward, what I'd like to do is that the remainder of our time till about 1 o'clock is set aside for questions and answers and comments and so forth. And so if you could raise your hands, preferably using the reactions button on your screen so that I can see it, and I'll just try to keep track of the order so everybody gets an opportunity as much as time permits to ask Jack some questions and have him tell you what he thinks about it. So we've already got some eager hands, so we'll start with Dan Cervone and then follow up with Monica.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Blaine, for the invitation. I'm just guessing, without, of course, seeing the data, that sometimes, if I can use Blaine's word, sometimes the narratives are less magical than the usher in church and the loving granddaughter.
Yeah.
When you get a less, I'm going to use the word interesting narrative, what do you make of it? That the person simply lacks a coherent, complex life story, or that your method has failed to detect that life story, which could be for obviously a host of reasons you already thought of, like the person doesn't want to tell you that life story.
Yeah. That's right. These are examples that are not just about a good life, but definitely that are, just good stories. And, those are outliers. Most narratives are less dramatic, but very few narratives lack themes. So there are themes of agency and communion and moral concerns and growth and all kinds of things in most people's life stories. Maybe not in every theme and in every narrative, but they all have them, and they also have tones, and like from positive to negative, and the structures vary from complex, and it's the high complexity. It's all a relative term, and so most of them are somewhere in between, right? And
but are you saying they're all equally valid, even when you get some that seem utterly lacking in drama? No, I'm asking like the personality psychologist validity question.
Yeah. Well, so if for valid, there are a few things that we can mean here. So first of all, do people go about in their everyday life thinking like they do in our interviews? That's the hope, but that's also the same hope you get when people take a self-report survey. And one of the things that I like about narrative research is that it's actually not subjective. Most of the research is objectively scored by multiple researchers, which allows different kind of conclusions you can make. But in terms, the more the person talks, so the more questions you can ask, the more likely you're going to get a nice distribution of different themes and people. So these narratives came from a study that, with interviews that lasted 2 hours, and we ask, 19 different questions. And, some people talked for only an hour to an hour and a half. Some people talked for a few hours. You've got 60 to 70 pages of text. Still, it's still a small sample from their life, and it's that particular day. But, some great research is being done by some of my colleagues. Kate McLean and Jen Lilgendahl are doing this great longitudinal research. Dan McAdams and I have done some longitudinal. A lot of people are doing narrative longitudinal research. That is it's massively time consuming and resource intensive, but it's the same principles apply to any measure for the validity of it, validity question. So.
Thanks. I hadn't realized they were that lengthy. So yes.
Yeah, some of them are. Oh, that's right. I stopped with that. Some measures, perhaps most these days, are measures where you ask a person a single question, and it's not face-to-face, but it's written, and they're given, this much space, and you can technically call that narrative, and it's fine with me. How something is defined is you look at the methods. That's how you know what it is. And it's, the thing is though, that it's kind of like, just like in person perception and measuring personality, the thin slice idea of measuring personality, that's kind of what that is when you measure a thin slice of personalities. And those are predictive in much the same ways as it's just the data are just less robust. So.
Okay, let's hear from Monica.
Hi, Jack. Very interesting presentation. And one of the things that kept me thinking about this, so you have this hedonic well-being and then eudaimonia, And I really like that at the end you brought this master narrative in. So here's my question. I noticed you didn't distinguish between, in terms of satisfaction or well-being, subjective well-being, pleasure. What is it based on, right? I mean, it can be a very egocentric pleasure, or I get pleasure by exploiting others, right? Because it shows me I'm smarter than you. And the same with meaning, right? I mean, there is these different kind of meanings: individualistic meaning, collective meaning, cosmic meaning. And because if it's individualistic meaning, I mean, a long time ago, I did some qualitative interviews, and I asked about what's the meaning of your life. And one person said, the meaning of life is to make money, and that is related also to this, to this cultural narrative, because in this country, this is what it is, right? So I'm just, if you can talk a little bit, if you looked at the differences between, levels of meaning, levels of subjective well-being, individualistic, communal, something like this.
Yes. So levels of meaning. Oh, see, you use that word. I'm going to get suckered into this idea, this rabbit hole. It's a developmental question. Yes, you can study it in terms of levels of particularly narrative structure and the complexity and coherence, kind of in the like Lovinger's measure of ego development, kind of a lot of neo-Piagetian approaches to measuring narratives. So you can do that. I think most of the stuff that you were just talking about, Monica, had to do with, I think, a distinction between tone and theme. So say you have a narrative that, especially when you ask, the prompt matters a lot, by the way, the type of question you ask. If you're ever going to do narrative research, make sure it's a good question that's focused on actions. And this is a side note, it's focused on actions and, why, who was there, when, who, what, where, when, the journalistic questions, but then why, and how do you feel about that now, that kind of stuff. Any case, people will be talking about their events in a positive to negative way, or they're two separate, positivity and negativity are two separate measures. Whether that pleasure that they're getting, that satisfaction that they're getting, is for materialist reasons or humanist reasons, that's theme. That's where theme comes in. And that's, in fact, that distinction is like the central focus of my research, is the most amount of research. The thing that I code the most is for themes of essentially humanistic / humane versus materialistic / egoistic themes, which I call growth themes. And so these are tied, like you said, and those have very clear relations to measures of well-being. It doesn't matter what age, although actually, we find that these kinds of growth themes mediate any relation between like life satisfaction and age, where you find that in some studies. This will mediate it in every study we've done. So it's not so much that they're older and happier, it's that they're older and they're happier, and that's at least statistically accountable to these growth themes, this focus on humane kinds of concerns. So all this stuff has correlates with well, really, they're the self-report versus narrative measures of the same thing, as I see it, but it's a matter of construct validity in that sense. But then the tie to cultural master narratives is great. It's so great. So on the one hand, there's the idea in one of the early ideas in cultural master narrative research is that, if you are speaking in a way that reflects the cultural master narrative, then you'll feel good because this is what a culture values. But that's actually not the case. What matters more is the theme, the type of theme. Is it more humanistic and humane versus materialistic and egoistic? That makes a big difference. By the way, I should say that I got that idea from self-determination theory, and then I borrowed that and put it and found how to code that in narratives. So that's kind of the background on that. So where it gets really tricky is in when you're dealing with marginality. Okay, so all right. No, all right, I've got slides on this. I'm resisting the urge to put them up. The good life as portrayed by cultural master narratives requires certain resources, right? And even when those resources are humane and humanistic, it turns out, this is my take on this, that human, and I write about that in the book, it turns out that those tend to be experientially focused. You're either focused on your own experience as opposed to your status and self-image, or other people's experience. You're doing things to help other people for their welfare. To be focused on experience versus more concrete things like money or even social status is more concrete than that, requires resources. Kind of I think in a Maslow hierarchy kind of way, at least regarding some of the earlier versus the later types of concerns. And kind of like Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach has had a big impact on me. That certain basic human resources are needed for basic human needs to be met so that we can flourish. An empirical example is the work of Louis Tay and Ed Diener did these great, huge studies of 120 some countries and tens of thousands of people. And they found that, people who were worried that day about their physical health or their life or some kind of physical threat were almost hardly ever were focused on kinds of things that involve like meaningful human experiences and things like that. It was, so there's a lot of evidence for that. And so I think it would depend on the type of cultural master narrative to which one ascribes, is my answer. And there are many, and in complex cultures, there are complex master narratives and what Moinsad and Kate McLean call alternative narratives to that. And Moyne does this great research, and also Phil Hammock and some others does great research on cultural master narratives and marginality, where across various forms of marginality, socioeconomic status, race, gender, sexuality, and various intersectionalities of that, one of the most dominant themes that you see is a need for connection. Like a need to belong, because there's this social alienation and the resources will go with that. And and that's speaking with a very broad brush, but
yeah, thank you.
To the degree we speak with a brush, but so much for that metaphor. Okay.
Okay, well, Elizabeth, what question do you have for Jack?
Hi, Jack. Thank you for your presentation. It was excellent. And we haven't had the pleasure of meeting, but I am a psychology doctoral student here at Baylor, and I work with Sarah Schnicker. I was particularly interested in the bit of your presentation where you shared some empirical findings. And I was particularly curious about, I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on the finding that experiential growth themes were a unique predictor of virtues. Can you please elaborate for me what connotes experiential growth themes? And then I was also wondering, the slide went a bit quick for me, which virtues did you measure?
Okay, yeah, great, thanks. Experiential growth themes are narratives that express a value orientation for experientially meaningful activities, so doing things you love, or experientially meaningful relationships, rather than having relationships or doing activities for the purpose of status or your self-image, like proving things to yourself, these kinds of things. Again, these are things that actually take some luxuries to enact on a routine basis if research is any indication. So that's what those themes are focused on those kinds of things. And the reason is that they get at the theoretical mechanisms of what most people call personal growth. So the person doesn't have to say, I want to grow for it to be coded as a growth theme. And so probably for 20 years, I've been mislabeling it, honestly, but it's because it's too removed that I call it growth themes, but they theoretically foster growth, and they're the strongest predictors of all kinds of measures of development. So it works somehow, but it's tough to get across. And so you have to ask a question like that because it's not intuitive. And so I very much appreciate you asking. And so other measures that other narrative measures that we correlated with this host of virtues were positive affect, negative affect globally, redemption sequences from bad to good, positive outcome affect, that didn't necessarily start out bad. Some of them just end well, and that's positive outcome also. Structural complexity, agentic themes, communal themes, a whole host of things, complexity and coherence. And yeah, it was these experiential themes, these focus, because really they focus on humane kinds of things. It's kind of moral, it's kind of like embedded in the theme. So as for the types of virtues, there was altruism, forgiveness, compassion, both compassion for others in the typical sense, self-compassion, gratitude. We had other measures that I consider virtues. So a measure that my colleague and I made called the Heidi Wayment and I made called the quiet ego, which is that it's like humility, but in 4 different components correlated with that. It involves keeping self and others, the welfare of the self and others in balance, that kind of thing. Yeah, those were the main ones.
Thank you. That's helpful. Thanks for elaborating on those measures. One last quick question. Did you run any analyses in which virtues were independent variables for predicting like eudaimonic well-being or meaning?
We did, but I can't remember.
Okay.
What the hypothesis was. I had a student who had a hypothesis. On that, is there any particular thing you're interested in?
Probably more so the meaning. But I wonder, would you or even Blaine mind putting that citation in the chat box and I can go explore for myself at some point?
Okay. The citation for those findings?
Yeah.
Okay, they're in press now. So
Okay,
I can send you that though, if you so.
I'm just too excited, a little bit eager over
Wow,
here.
that makes me so happy. Thank you.
I'm glad you asked, Elizabeth. I want to see the article too.
Thanks,
Well,
Jack.
Veronica, you've been very patient. Do you still remember your question?
Well, I'm getting on in age, so I actually wrote it down. I'm okay. So Jack, it was a pleasure to listen to your talk. I really like the richness of your thinking, the intuitiveness of your thinking. It's refreshing given that I'm surrounded most of the time by a more cut and dry kind of approach to research. So very refreshing. One of the things that you talked about that got me really excited was this concept of perspectivity. And I wonder if you could talk more about that. I mean, in my own head, I kind of went off on a tangent and I started developing my own definition of this idea. I'm not quite sure if it's what you meant by the concept. So, you used the example of freedom, and you talked about sort of this differentiation between, an oversimplified conception of freedom where, you're not even sure it's freedom anymore. It's freedom to do whatever the heck you want, a more sophisticated version of freedom. And I started thinking, the word sophisticated, mature, maybe even a differentiation in quality or something. So I have 2 questions for you. My first question is, what is it that you were trying to get at? Because often what we try to get at conceptually and then what we actually are able to operationalize are a little bit sort of different. So I'm wondering if there's more that you can say about the concept that you were trying to assess, And then in terms of the methodology, do you have, in addition to coherence and complexity, do you have any additional hunches as to what other dimensions could be measured to assess the concept?
Yeah, wow, that's great. I'm trying to think of what. What I was trying to do, both with the good life, and like many of us here, we're trying to come up, how to make sense of the sprawling, crazy field, the good life, and there are all kinds of frameworks for doing that. So I was interested in that, and I was interested in finding, well, what are certain umbrella categories or superordinate categories of goods that have non-overlapping qualities to them. Okay. And then I was doing the same thing with narrative identity, with elements of narrative identity. Again, I was doing this for like 15 to 20 years before I finally realized what was going on. And it all kind of came together, and what it as value perspective. What they both deal with is the complexity and coherence with which we think about value. And I probably arrived at that because I'm a developmental psychologist. I was trained in a Piagetian background, kind of combined Piaget and Erikson. But on the Piaget side, it's assimilation and accommodation, differentiation and integration, just core basic, how are things different and how are they the same? Basic qualities of cognition is what I was trying to get at. I'm trying to get at fundamental properties of thinking in the context of the good. And so that's, I don't know if that addresses what you're saying, but that's how I'm interpreting your question and what I was thinking. Are there other ways to go about it? Yeah, there, like in narrative psychology, structure is studied in so many different ways. And I spend a chapter trying to tease out how a lot of that actually isn't just pure structure. It's mostly content of tone and theme. But some other ways are what's called positioning. There isn't a whole lot of research on this in the quantitative study of narratives, but in the qualitative study of narratives, there's this rich literature on narrative positioning. So how you, and especially cultural master narratives comes into play here with this. How do you position yourself relative to others? It could be interpersonal, it could be collective, in various ways, and all kinds of great work like Robin Fivish's work and Kate McLean's work on family stories and family master narratives. So there's master narratives for all different levels of social group. And with cultural master narratives, all this positioning, and that's a structural thing. How is the self related to others? And there are all kinds of great cultural differences there. It depends on how you even define what the self is. Are you embedded with others, or is it you in relation to others as individual units? All these kinds of things come into play with looking at the structural elements of narrative. And I think the same thing in a non-narrative way, what's the structural aspect of the good? So I guess that's another way, is that I was looking at what's the structural aspect of the good.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, Cynthia, you also have been patient, and did you write it down?
I did, actually. It's right here. So I just want to say thank you for a super interesting talk. You have another Kindle sale. I'm compiling my list of sabbatical readings, and your book is now on it.
Thank you.
And I am particularly interested in studying the specific virtue of courage, and I've been doing a ton of thin narrative research sort of throughout my career with this. We've tried to get the richer, longer narratives, but we've just had problems with data collection, and yeah, so I'm not, you probably know.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah, so at any rate, I'm curious if I just want to make sure I'm understanding this basic understanding that I think I'm coming away with is right, that the extent to which your personal narrative of, say, a time you acted courageously matches the cultural narrative of what courage is, that's the extent to which you're going to think that that was courageous, or that you were acting courageously.
Yes, that would be
Yeah.
one source of your idea of what courage is. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic, fantastic. Good. That overlaps with findings that we have, but it gives me a nice new way to explain
Oh,
them.
yeah.
That is wonderful. Are there, in your research, have you found that there's, I love that you have all these different components of the different types of narratives, and I assume that those components also apply to cultural narratives?
Exactly. Same exact ones. It's just narration.
Fantastic. And so are there specific components of narration that match is more important between the personal incident and the cultural narrative? Like, or is it just an overall overlay, or is like one component more important than others?
Ooh, wow. Probably some components are more important than others, but I would say it all depends on what you are looking for what's important.
Okay.
So, yeah. So like if it's
Yeah.
courage, maybe some aspect of courage. So like to me, that's a theme. So,
Yeah.
moral, I call it moral agency. Moral courage could have been
Yeah.
the defining theme of that,
Sure.
of that narrative.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that okay, so I'm relying on some of Kate McLean's work on family narratives. So what happens if you get families into the lab and you interview them about key events that were important to them. And she noticed that not everybody fits into each story equally. And then some members within the family don't fit into several of the family stories. And so there's some dynamic. There's a lot of positioning going on there that is interesting. But then that person is in the position of having to come up with an alternative narrative that works for them, because the family narrative isn't working for them. The family wants them to be something that they don't want to be. And it's very clear, and especially when you see it in the interview. And I did family stories too with this study, and it can be crushing to watch this, but also fascinating and inspiring to see how people work through it. And then another person might see that this is happening. In any case, the dynamics are amazing. So imagine, a master narrative of courage, where would that be needed? You would see that in a lot of, there's a cultural master narrative of courage. We see in kids' books, courage, the theme of courage will be embodied by a whole character, and that will be the courageous character and whatnot. But there will be also courage in the face of other themes in a cultural master narrative that might be oppressive to a person. Courage could be really important in that kind of case. Yeah. So
and especially with courage, we put up monuments and statues and stuff about it too. So like I for years I've been going around and taking cell phone pictures of like a courage monuments and stuff, and my poor family is just like, oh, let's go. But they all have kind of specific themes. And so a lot of the master narrative of it involves doing things for other people rather than doing it for yourself. And there are, and usually the thing that the person's overcoming is some sort of external threat, not some kind of internal threat. There's literally one example that I know of a monument in the US of overcoming an internal threat. And it's a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt on the FDR Memorial saying, "I think Franklin's illness gave him the courage to blah, 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 blah." And so even in that case, she's saying that, he developed this courage to face this internal problem of his, but he then applied that externally. And that's a theme that we've seen. We've also seen a theme that you've got to be successful at doing whatever the thing is that you want to do. And even our participants who say you don't need to be successful to be courageous, like that's not what their data says when you ask them to rate the courage of various narratives. It's less successful if it's not or it's less courageous if it's not successful. And so, yeah, so I was just struck by the overlap between what I'm doing and what you're doing. And I was like, wow, this is a new and more comprehensive way to look at this thing that I've been looking at. So thank you for that.
Just thank you. That's wonderful. I mean, as themes of courage come up a lot in people's narratives. Again, prompt matters a lot. So low points and turning points in life, you see a lot of courage themes. And a few that come to mind that deal with illness, kind of like the Roosevelt one that you mentioned. One actually that deals with polio is one of the first one. I guess that's why it came to mind. The was this person, overcame, he fought the enemy polio and went on to become a world champion athlete in this, in this, and he attributes it to the illness. So that's great. And moral courage is a great, or the other is such a wonderful thing.
I'm sure it is. And I think there's in our studies, we've also found a lot of like personal growth in our narratives of courage, because they're people who took some kind of a risk for personal growth, like leaving home to go to college far away, or going to a more challenging academic program, or taking a more challenging job. And so we've seen that also. So but I think those don't match up with the cultural narrative of courage as much, and people actually rate those as less courageous for most people and more just courageous for them.
I can see. The first time I noticed courage as a part of a cultural master narrative was after 9/11.
Oh yeah.
I remember it was like it was in the firefighters, that was symbolic of courage. And they're doing something nobody finds controversial either. So, saving people from dying in a fire, like no one's going to say that's a terrible thing, you ought not do that, compared to speaking up for women serving, being an usher at church. Like some people probably think that's horrible. So very interesting. That's fabulous, Cynthia. Thank you.
As much as I hate to do it, we have come to the end of our time. Thank you again, Jack, for presenting a wonderful talk and helping us to think through the good life from a narrative perspective. I think it's a fascinating topic. And thank you all for being such a great audience. I mean, a lot of engagement and interest. And I think it's really makes it fun to do this together, that it's not just one person, but it's all of us together having these conversations. And I'll just mention also that one of the things I liked about Jack's talk is how interdisciplinary it was, and how often he was talking about people from different disciplines. So I think that was really nice, and a good embodiment of what we're about here, as is the membership of this group. So it's great to see you, some of you coming from very far away through the internets. So we appreciate you making time and being able to do that. And I hope to see lots of you in the coming weeks. And next week, we're going to hear from Maria Silvia Vacareza. She unfortunately had to go, so I can't point her out to you, but maybe you noticed that she was here too. Taking notes, trying to figure out how did Jack do this so well? I got to do that well too. But no, I don't think she has any trouble with that. She'll give a great talk as well. But anyway, farewell, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you,
Bye, everyone.
Thank
Take care.
Thank you.
Take care.